The meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Alaska is not just a meeting of two leaders to discuss geopolitical issues. Donald Trump is projecting his political formula onto this screen, mainly for domestic American politics, to show the American voter that he is capable of stopping the bloodshed without dragging the United States into war. The White House has already carefully called it a meeting. Listening exercise is a listening exercise, and the translation from diplomatic language is very simple. If there are no real agreements, we were just listening. If there's any progress, it means the process has begun. That's why the meaning of this meeting will be determined, of course, not by the paperwork, but by the statements made on camera. Let's see what Trump and Putin will say at the press conference. For Ukraine, it's crucial that three things are publicly mentioned. Kyiv's role in next steps, real security guarantees, not just slogans, and keeping sanctions until Russia acts. But in this story, the domestic American context plays a very significant role, and the upcoming midterm elections in Congress, plus the preparations for the next Republican presidential campaign. In this episode, we'll discuss the domestic American context of the Alaska negotiations, focusing on Donald Trump's internal motives and the negotiation framework. So how do we avoid turning this worldview into a trap for Ukraine? And unfortunately, Trump can do that. He can present the American voter with a beautiful picture of stopping the slaughter, but not ending the war. Let's sort all this out now. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is August 15th. And before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give a like, write any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my channel. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, let's start with the fact that Kyiv has already put on the table what Trump and the Europeans must take into account. Volodymyr Zelenskyy held a video conference with Trump and the leaders of the European Union on August 13th, and from the very first phrases he set the tone. Quote, Putin is bluffing, trying to pressure before the Alaska meeting and make sanctions seem ineffective. Sanctions are effective, both aiding and harming Russia's economy. Moving on. He honestly added about such a resource imbalance. Quote, Russia has 3 times more artillery, but at the same time, the enemy has 3 times more losses. Next, as they say, comes a kind of diagnosis of intentions. Quote, Putin doesn't want peace. He wants to occupy our country. We need more pressure, including American and European sanctions, for peace. And, all these points from Volodymyr Zelenskyy, they're not just some kind of emotional appeal, are they? From them, a set of 5 principles emerged, which, according to Zelenskyy, Trump agreed to use as the basis for negotiations with Putin. Everything concerning Ukraine is discussed only with Ukraine. Ceasefire and solid security guarantees come first. Everything else follows. Russia has no veto right over Kyiv's European and NATO course. Sanctions stay and intensify if Moscow rejects a ceasefire, while negotiations continue alongside the pressure. What's very important is that Trump has already made this clear today. He says, no, I won't discuss territorial issues without Ukraine. Ukraine will have the final say. So, these 5 principles have at least partially worked. Europe has publicly and quite firmly fit into this framework, into these 5 principles. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz made a statement the Kremlin likely disliked. Quote, Ukraine is ready to discuss territorial issues, but the starting point should be the front line, and recognition of the Russian occupation is not up for discussion. Then I added 2 key conditions. Quote, Kyiv must join future talks, and Ukraine requires lasting security guarantees. French President Emmanuel Macron, paraphrasing Trump, stressed he seeks a ceasefire in Ukraine, but territorial issues require Ukraine's involvement. There's also this connection. Any discussions about territories must be strictly linked to security guarantees. Security guarantees range from air defense and long-range missiles to ammunition production in Ukraine and, of course, funding. In this context, the United States has brought out its main lever. These are sanctions. Finance Minister Scott Bessent stated during negotiations, all options are on the table. Sanctions can be tightened, eased, or set to expire. And it's critical that Europe joins the United States and helps create more leverage. This is the point where Trump's domestic policy to show quick results meets reality. Any advance given to the Kremlin for talk rather than facts will end up as a failure in the medium term, both for Ukraine and for the United States of America. Because Moscow will immediately, convert this flexibility of Trump into propaganda, first of all, and secondly, into the regrouping of its troops. So yes, Trump can announce like, listen, we've achieved a ceasefire, but nothing more. And in the short term, it may look like a victory. In the medium and long term, it could turn into a major disaster. And here, domestic politics in the United States comes into play. President Trump wants to show that he is capable of stopping the war where Biden allowed it to escalate. This is a quote from the White House communications advisor, cited by the Washington Post in this morning's article. The Washington Post journalist says this phrase captures the campaign's goal, using the summit to build a peacemaker image. Before the start of the decisive phase of the congressional election campaign, and then moving on to the presidential one. According to Reuters, Trump's team is deliberately avoiding specific statements about the content of the negotiations in order to leave room for maneuver and not provoke a political crisis if the meeting does not yield tangible results. One of the officials In addition, Bloomberg writes, Trump's headquarters. But the tactic carries the risk that Ukraine may find itself under pressure for a quick decision. For a photo on the evening news. In addition, Bloomberg writes today that Trump's team is considering possible agreements with Putin through the lens of the internal economy of the United States of America. Quote, if the outcome of the meeting helps lower gas prices and inflation, it will become an electoral bonus. That's why there's all this caution in the sanctions rhetoric. Well, United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent emphasized, quote, all options are on the table. Sanctions can be tightened, they can be eased, and they can have expiration dates. Why is domestic politics, the political landscape of the United States of America, so important? Because it explains why Trump will now reach for a ceasefire formula here and now. For the American voter, this is a clear result that is achieved on the very first day. He met with Putin and immediately there is a ceasefire. Or at the very least, there is an agreement that it will happen soon. But Ukraine, has already paid for such ceasefires without guarantees with Minsk I and Minsk II. And here, the key protection is public specifics. Public specifics. If today, after the meeting in Alaska, you hear a phrase like, we agreed to reduce the intensity of the fighting. This should go in one sentence with 3 markers. Discussions on this topic require Ukraine's participation with security guarantees, sanctions on Russia and Hollywood's involvement until all conditions are fulfilled. Without this, any pause is essentially a new status quo for the Kremlin. Let me add Moscow's motivation here. The Kremlin needs a pause that can be presented as a step toward peace. In reality, they would use it to bring up reserves, make shells, buy weapons via third countries, mobilize, etc. It's no coincidence. That's why there are meetings, editor. In Alaska, the Russians have intensified attacks near Dobropilya and to the west of Donetsk. This is not a strategic breakthrough, it's just a television image. I liked how the Institute for the Study of War wrote about this today, saying that there was no strategic breakthrough there, and basically the Russians didn't have the forces in that direction for a strategic breakthrough. But they needed to create some informational noise, they needed to show a nice picture. Well, nice in quotes, like, look, we're advancing in all directions, breaking through the front line everywhere. That's why it would be better for Trump to accept Putin's terms. That's the very Trump card that, Putin turns into an argument. Like, let's have a ceasefire now, firmly establish the line of contact, and discuss everything else later. Again, we'll discuss it later if Ukraine isn't ready to give up all the territories right away. In this chess position, there are 3 scenarios. The optimistic scenario is a public agreement that Ukraine is negotiating security guarantees and sanctions are being discussed in detail until the conditions of the Russian Federation are met. The compromise is less intense fighting, a promise of future trilateral talks and no sanction relief. And negative means a freeze, a status quo, silence on the front for vague promises, unclear guarantees, and possible flexibility with sanctions. So basically, Putin just gets a pause, and that's it. Ukraine actually gets nothing. You might say Ukraine also gets a pause. In the short term, this is a victory, but it could become a catastrophe in the medium or long term. And these are not my words. These are the conclusions of Western analysts. In conclusion, it can be said that the image of Donald Trump as a peacemaker inside the United States should not come at the expense of Ukraine. This could be avoided with one honest statement from Donald Trump on camera. If today he says that we have agreed that a ceasefire should be established, future negotiations should only include Ukraine, with security guarantees for Ukraine and all sanctions staying until Moscow takes real action. That will be a victory for the framework of Ukraine and Europe. If not, then sorry, that's an invitation to Minsk Agreements 3. Only this time with higher stakes. And yes, I'll repeat Zelensky's words because that's the essence of the moment. Putin is bluffing, sanctions really do help and hit the Russian economy, and bluffing only works where people believe it. And today, it seems to me, is exactly the day when you can't believe Putin. We need a totally new approach to these negotiations. I'll leave it there for now. We're waiting for the negotiations, results, and press conference. I'll cover everything on this YouTube channel, so subscribe, share your expectations in the comments, and click the bell for notifications. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video or by using the QR code on your screens. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone. Subtitles by Dima Tozok.